Do you know what I've done? So I've had this discussion that got me thinking about this a couple months ago with some other Cup drivers. And we asked the question, how many true pro race car drivers are in the world, right? So then I did some Googling. I did find some numbers out there. I did my own math. And according to Autosport, and this was the number actually that myself and these other Cup drivers had come to, and obviously what you define to be pro is a bit of a murky discussion, so just take this all with a grain of salt. But I thought it brought out a fun stat. Our thought process is that of true professional race car drivers who are making a living driving race cars in the world, there's probably about 200. That's it, right? And that's crazy, but if you really think about it and you look at series and you look at, who's there making a living, that sort of thing, it really kind of comes to this math. So I had ChatGPT do a little math for me because I asked it the question. I said, all right, if there's only 200 pro race car drivers, there's 8 billion people in the world. What is your chance right now of becoming a professional race car driver? It's 1 in 40 million, which is the hardest and highest of any pro sport. Just to give some comparison, golf, there's about 400 of them that are pro, 350 to 400 if you count their series and such. That would be a 1 in 20 million chance. An NFL player with 696 active roster players, 332 million that are in the U.S. Now this gets a little murky because it's versus U.S. versus world, but I don't know how many international NFL players there are, but probably not a lot. It's 1 in 195,000. An NBA player for just the U.S. would be 1 in 730,000. An MLB player for just out of the U.S., your chance is 1 in 420,000. Kind of wild. Yeah. So
it's not a lot of seats, man.
Not a lot of seats, and we can say on this podcast, you're listening to two people who had a 1 in 40 million chance of doing the thing that they did, and we did it.
We're the lucky ones.
Come to us.
We are the lucky ones.
We're the lucky ones. We're experts in luck. This leads into the next thing, the Xfinity Series. Chandler Smith gets out after Homestead, had a tough finish because he had a pit road issue, drove it off the jack in the final stop, and didn't net a top 10. Was asked about his chances at Martinsville, and he said he didn't really have anything to lose because he doesn't have a ride for next year, and he could be working for his dad's construction company. Thoughts on this?
There's a lot of thoughts. There's a lot of thoughts. You go first.
Well, I think this is the dark side of the sport, and it's very murky and it's not well understood, and that is obviously the funding side. And I see even on Reddit, which I consider to be probably the most educated part of our fan base in terms of just they know so much, they are so invested in the sport, that sort of thing. And even I see comments like, wait, he's not being paid millions of dollars to be here? Wait, how is this possible? So on and so forth. They don't really understand the nature of how the business works and how this sport is funded. And I think that is always going to be tough because it's just not public, and it's not, a lot of times it's put behind smoke and mirrors and that sort of thing. At the end of the day, Chandler has had funding to race in the races in the teams that he has, and it sounds like his funding was not of that level anymore at Joe Gibbs, and does not have enough to be in the level of ride he wants to be in, or does not have any funding, right? And therefore, your options are going to become incredibly small, excruciatingly small without funding, no matter how successful you've been. That's just the nature of the business. I think it is unusual, though, for a driver who's had the level of funding he's had and had success to not have any sort of opportunities, but that, going back to it, is just simply the nature of this. Now, I'm sort of leading you into your point, which I know your point, and that goes back to only 200 pro race drivers in the world. There's only so many seats. Mm-hmm. So go into your point.
So my point, and I kind of tweeted about this. Oops, sorry, I bumped my mic.
How dare
I
you?
tweeted about this, and then we texted about it and talked a little bit about it. I wonder if part of the problem here is there's not enough demand for drivers. And what I mean by that is that one thing that is unique to motorsports, especially NASCAR, is that NASCAR Cup Series drivers have a very long potential life cycle. You can have a 20-year, you can easily have a 20-year career in NASCAR. Right? Look at all the drivers that do and have. Right? Right now in seats, Denny Hamlin, Joey Logano, Kevin Harvick just retired. Dale Jr. just retired a couple years ago. Right? Jimmy Johnson.
I think he retired almost 8 years ago.
8 years ago? Gosh,
7
I'm
years
old.
ago.
I'm old.
I know
I'm
what you're
old.
saying. I know what you're saying. Brad Keselowski.
Brad Keselowski
yeah.
still in it.
Yep.
Right?
I mean,
The
Kyle
Ryan
Larson's got to
Newman,
be.
Greg Biffle.
Kyle Larson's over a decade already.
And is not stopping anytime soon.
Yep.
Kyle Busch, right, has made it clear he wants to race with his kid. Maybe not in the Cup Series, but NASCAR drivers, Cup Series drivers, have a very, very long life cycle. Over 20 years, and there's only 36 seats. Right?
Yep.
And we just rattled off, I think you could easily rattle off 10 names, 15. I don't even have a list in front of me. I should pull up the entry list. Stenhouse, Jones. I mean, look at these guys that have been at that level for 15 plus years and are not stopping anytime soon. Stenhouse, not stopping anytime soon. Jones, not stopping anytime soon. Right? And I bring those guys up specifically, not to put them on the spot, but I bring them up specifically because they're in, let's just call it replaceable seats. They're not dominating anything right now, but they're also really good drivers, and they're doing a really good job. But they're not winning, right? And so they're driving for teams that need...
Except for Stenhouse just won Talladega, but yeah, no, I get what you're saying.
Well, Stenhouse wins. But they're not, they're in a team that is in a, could at any given moment could be a 25th place, have a 25th place season, or they could, maybe they have some sponsorship and some potential performance. They could rip off a couple wins in a season, and it could be as a result of the driver or could be a result of other resources. Who knows, right? That's what those teams are trying to figure out on a weekly basis, is where do we find more speed? And the team, but one thing that the team is never really forced to do is replace the driver. Where you take other sports, football, and sports that have more. I don't know. I don't know what the reason is that those athletes have shorter life cycles, but they have shorter life cycles, right? In football, it's physical, obviously, physical reasons. Those players can't make it 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the position you play, without a career-ending injury. And so those positions are... And now, granted, there's a lot more positions available on a football roster in 32 teams as opposed to one driver available in 36 Cup Series teams. But that almost plays into what I'm saying. It's like they have a shorter life cycle of players and more spots available, right? Where NASCAR has more than 10 times fewer available seats for a driver to be in, and a 5 times longer life cycle of a career. And so the demand for new drivers is just so much lower.
You got to bring either, to break in, and I think Josh just pointed out it's more like NFL QBs, right? There's only 32 of them. You've got to bring in immense momentum and fervor about your talent, right? A la Kyle Larson. You either have to bring an immense amount of funding to change the nature and outcome with talent for a team, maybe it's a lesser team, right? Or a combination of both. And it's like, that's what's going to help you break into a 20-year cycle that is drivers. When you and I were trying to break in the Cup Series, I can remember back in 2013 and 2012 and 2011, 2014. I mean, some of those, the drivers that have been in the same ride for 12 years, 13 years, 14. It was like I remember looking at one day and going, I'm never going to get there. Like I was in the Xfinity Series. I was in the trucks winning races, and I turned to someone and I said, how do we ever break in there? I was like,
So-
these guys have been here forever, right? And some of them didn't win races for 4 or 5 years, but it didn't matter because they were just ingrained into the sport and the team and the sponsor, whatever it was. And so it just it is unique in that sense. There isn't a lot of turnover potentially.
If you wanted to just narrow it down to quarterbacks, right? Mm-hmm. I just Google searched the average NFL quarterback has a 4-year career. Okay. Now, I'm looking at the Martinsville entry list right now. Let's just count Cup Series drivers that have had a 10-year career up to this point or are well on their way to blowing through a 10-year career, right?
Okay.
I'm starting at the top. Ross Chastain, 10 years in the Cup Series.
Yep.
Cindric is still pretty fresh. But let's skip him. Chastain, Dillon, skipping Barry, Larson, Keselowski. Haley's on his way, but we'll skip him. Kyle Busch, Chase Elliott, Denny Hamlin, Blaney. Where's Briscoe at?
His first year in Cup would have been 20. He's new.
Okay, we'll skip him. We'll skip Gralla. We'll skip Gisbergen, Busher, Truex, Bell, Logano, Wallace, Byron, Hemrick. He's been around though.
Yep. He's been in.
Let's skip Hemrick. McDowell is 15, right? Number 15 on my list. We'll skip Gilliland. I mean, we can even skip Preece. We can skip Nemechek. Eric Jones, Tyler Reddick, Stenhouse, Bowman, LaJoy. Well, that's 20.
36 seats. Yeah. And you didn't take
and
a
then
lot of
you've
liberties. It's either they've been there for 10 years or they're definitely going to be there for 10 years.
Yeah, like and then Ty Gibbs, not going anywhere anytime soon. We'll skip Zane Smith and Carson Hocevar because they're fresh, and then Daniel Suarez, right? 22.
And Daniel Suarez,
20?
I'd put in the 10 year. He'll get the 10.
Yeah. Well, no, I included so 22 including. So
Wow.
roughly 22, but call it 20 out of 36. There's 16 seats, right? And by the way, those 20 drivers are occupying the most valuable seats,
Yep.
right? So you have 16 seats to turn over, potentially, right? And well, maybe I could just save us the time on this podcast, but then let's look at we could look at those 16 drivers and go, okay, out of those 16 drivers, which one of those guys are at risk of turning over or are probably going to settle in, right?
I think you could make
And
an
so-
argument 8 to 10 of those are going to settle.
There's just no demand for drivers because drivers get to the Cup Series and they never leave, right?
Yep.
I mean, look at myself, right? I occupied a Cup seat I drove in 43 car fields and I drove in 40 car fields, but I occupied a Cup seat from 2010, from midway through 2010, completely through until the full season of 2019. And then I occupied a half seat, a seat part-time in 2022.
Yep.
Right? I skipped a little bit of time, but it's like,
You were a decade, basically.
yeah, I occupied a seat for a decade. And so
It's a great point.
There's no turnover there. There's not enough demand for drivers, and to me that is like we do spend a lot of time talking about the business model, right? And and teams are trying to figure. Obviously, there's a lawsuit right now over it. Basically, the teams are trying to figure out ways to afford to operate, and and a lot of times that falls on the drivers. It's like, well, this is why drivers have to bring sponsorship and all this stuff. But it's like, what if part of the problem isn't even like the amount of money and sponsorship and all this stuff? What if part of the problem as to why you have to bring sponsorship is because it is really freaking hard to get someone out of their seat?
I think it's a great point. Nobody talks about. You wouldn't have heard it anywhere else. And I think it was a great exercise to bring up. So for Chandler, back to the root of this, yes, there's money issues. In the lower series, that is just going to be the case. The economics don't make sense, right? For Xfinity teams, the the funding required to win versus the funding that comes from the sport is even more drastically different than what you have in the Cup Series. And so it's just going to be, it's even harder to stay there. Speaking of which,
Josh, what do you have?
Josh.
So
what's up?
I'm just thinking how other sports tackle that cycle problem of how do you prevent somebody from staying there forever versus getting new talent, what have you. In other series, you have the rookie contract system that limits how much a brand new person to the sport can get paid. And then only after 2-3 years committing with a certain team can they go to free agency and get what they feel their value is. Would that resolve that seat cycle issue where somebody, who occupies one of those main seats is getting paid? No,
because I think there's plenty of teams that could take a quote unquote cheaper driver, but it wouldn't make a large enough economic difference to them versus the driver they have that
there's drivers driving
sponsor.
The point. I'm sorry, I was talking over you there. I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
The point. The problem here, Josh, is that drivers are driving for negative money. They're paying to drive. Chandler Smith is paying to drive, right?
Fair.
And it's not. I don't mean that to say poorly on Chandler Smith, but like, even though he may be getting a salary from these teams that he's driving and a paycheck from these teams that he's driving for, but it's purely like comedic because he's the one bringing the sponsorship, right? He can command any salary he wants to drive for these teams because the teams go, yeah, just pay yourself whatever you want as long as you give us $3.5 million to operate the car, right?
Yep.
So chances are what Chandler's doing and a lot of these drivers are doing, I should refrain from calling him out so specifically because I don't know the details of his deal, but I've seen many deals with drivers similar to Chandler where it's like, yeah, their funding source brings $4.5 million to the table because the driver wanted to make $500,000, right? And so they really only needed to bring $4 million, but they brought $4.5 million so that the driver could have like a pay plan with bonuses and stuff so he could make $500,000. But at the end of the day, the driver's paying to drive. So I get you're not in the wrong frame of mind there, Josh. And I don't have specific ideas on how you would limit this other than the closest thing to it that I have is a tour card type assignment, right? Where you literally have an active licensing where you do not, if you don't meet a certain performance criteria, you lose your license or you're at risk of losing your license or something. I don't know.
Which also goes the other way, by the way. You know that the license system, which we've been on this a million times, the license system also goes the other way, of which Chandler, if you wanted to give him value, or me value, or you value, Landon, for running the Xfinity Series with a true licensing system, a la super license system, that says, hey, you just did 2 years in the NASCAR Xfinity Series, he's won 2 races or 3 races, I don't know how many he's won. He's won a couple races, he's finished X place in the championship, he is eligible for a NASCAR Cup Series license. If there was only 40 people that were eligible, 50 people each year that were eligible, let's put down that rate, so the people that do top well in trucks and well in Xfinity gives the Xfinity Series and the Truck Series more value. It gives those drivers value, and he might be in a different situation if only he was available as one of the Cup teams said, we need a driver. There's only these ones that have licenses. He's one of them. That might give him value. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It can work both ways. And then it could also be on the other side of what you're saying, which is if you don't perform over X amount of time, you could lose your license and be forced to go back to Xfinity or trucks.
Right.
Basically.
Right. Maybe it's not, maybe the solution, or if you were trying to tackle it this way, if the mandate was to increase driver value, then the solution may not be where we started this conversation, which was, oh, we need to turn over drivers quicker. We need to shorten their life cycles, right? Let's have them unbuckle their seatbelts so that they get injured more often, right? Like that's not maybe it's not that, right? Like shortening the life cycle of a driver or the career of a driver. you know that I say that jokingly, right?
Yes,
it's
I know,
not
I
like
know.
the only the only feasible way of doing it would be to say, okay, if you race for 5 years and haven't won, then you lose your license or something like that.
Or you finish outside the top 30 in points,
Right, or you
3
finish
years
outside,
in a row,
which that,
just like
that
a charter.
makes it tough, because then how do you decide who to let into the sport, right? Because the people you're letting into the Cup Series are unproven, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it is possible that what you just said, Parker, is a very smart idea, where you really, really, really tighten up the licensing requirements to even get into the Cup Series, and say the only way to get a Cup Series license is if you have finished top 5 in 10 Xfinity races.
Yep.
Right? Like, you have to be a well-established Xfinity Series driver to even get a license to
Totally
be
different
considered
sport
to race.
at that point.
So
Totally different.
What you're
Right.
saying is similar to the drafty car license system.
Yeah, there you go. Just like that.
There you go. Yes.
Let's. I think it's an interesting conversation. I would love to see the comments on YouTube and everyone else's thoughts on that license
Yeah, let's
system.
continue this one
Yeah.
next week.
I think we should definitely talk about license system and come up with it. Come through all the pitfalls. Definitely point out the pitfalls to us. We'll take that because we like these discussions. But I do think this sport would look entirely different with a true licensing system.